So excited to be here with you, Andrew. I was just telling, like, it feels like I've spent way more time with you than you have with me. Growing up, taking all of your courses, and you've really had a massive impact. I think over 8 million folks now have taken your courses. Is that right?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really thrilled and honored to hear that.
Like the past few years, it's been such a massive shift. And if you look at like historical analogies, what do you think are the ones that best represent what's going on right now?
I think AI is the new electricity. And one thing that's still not widely understood is how much it is a general purpose technology, like electricity 100 years ago. AI, be it the last generation, supervised machine learning, labeling things, which worked really well the last decade, and generative AI, really taking off in this decade. I think that these are general purpose technologies, meaning they're not useful just for one thing, they're useful for a lot of things. Yeah. So a lot of work lies ahead of us to figure out all those use cases and go and execute on them.
100%. What are you most excited about?
I find that if I look at, say, generative AI, widely talked about, there's activity at the hardware layer. So I know Jensen Huang, deeply thoughtful on that, completed Intel and NVIDIA. There's also the infrastructure layer, companies like large language model companies, providers providing APIs, fantastic work there. And then I think the amount of creativity and diversity in the application layer, I find that my teams have enjoyed taking AI and applying it to maritime shipping or to helping entrepreneurs build relationship coaching apps or healthcare or education. But I find that all corners of the economy, affecting all people in all walks of life, that application layer, there's so much creativity. And frankly, from a business point of view, it doesn't feel nearly as competitive as the infrastructure or the hardware layers. So there's just so many opportunities there.
So how do you think about it as an entrepreneur building on the application layer as these models become increasingly commercialized? What do you think are the new moats or how to build defensibility?
So what I'm seeing is that there are startups that are building a very thin layer on top of very powerful APIs, leading to good ideas that are not defensible. For example, I think last December, Lensa, don't even play with it, upload a handful of pictures of yourself and render a picture of you as an astronaut or scientist, something really cool. Fantastic idea. It was a great idea. And I think its revenues took off through December and then collapsed.
Yeah.
I think with one earlier revolution with the iPhone, I paid $199 for the app to turn my phone into a flashlight. It was a great idea, but not a defensible business. So I think in the LLM, large language model era as well, there are also going to be thin application layers. But what I'm more excited about is just as with the rise of the iPhone, someone figured out you can build Airbnb or Uber or Tinder, these long-term businesses that are very valuable. I think with the rise of generative AI as a technology, I think there are opportunities to build those really difficult, but then also really valuable products for lots of people. And candidly, it's been interesting. Deep learning started to work really well maybe 10, 15 years ago. We've not even finished figuring out the use cases for that general purpose technology. And now generative AI is another major tool with even more work, even more opportunities to figure out these exciting use cases.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How are you thinking, if you look at the more foundational layer, how should you think about the unit economics of these large language models? They have a fairly short shelf life, require a lot of investment. What are the unit economics like on the foundational layer?
Yeah, it's been interesting. When I look at, say, the ChatGPT pricing, or actually not the API call, the most popular model is called GPT 3.5 Turbo. If you look at if you assume someone reads 250 words per minute, figure out the economics, it turns out that I estimated it'll cost me about 8 cents to generate enough text to keep someone busy for an hour reading.
Yeah.
So the economics are fantastically cheap in terms of the cost of an API call to generate a lot of text to keep someone, entertained or usefully engaged for quite a long time. One of the things about the cloud businesses is that they're so efficient that to users, it can feel pretty cheap to use a cloud service, even though cloud businesses are fantastically profitable, even though users think it's cheap. So this is good for everyone building applications. And then I do think that with Google's release of the Palm 2, different models like that, OpenAI, many other great companies, Anthropic, Amazon, Bedrock, on and on. I think that the LLM layer looks competitive, but I wish all of these companies luck, but that competition also creates a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurs building on the application layer.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of which, what do you think happens when the cost of knowledge work approaches zero? You were speaking of sort of generating text, and that could similarly be applied to a lot of the knowledge work that we do, that increasingly the cost goes towards zero. What happens then?
Yeah, so I think certain parts of knowledge work are becoming very inexpensive. There were a couple of fascinating studies I read quite closely, one by OpenAI and one of my collaborators, Daniel Rock at University of Pennsylvania, showing that unlike earlier ways of automation, where the lower wage workers tend to be more exposed to automation, this time around is actually the higher wage workers that are more exposed to automation via large language models. And so one of my radiologist friends, Kurt Langlois, said that radiologists that use AI will replace radiologists that don't use AI. And I think it'll be like that in a lot of professions, that people of a certain profession that figure out how to use AI will just have significant advantages compared to people in that profession that don't figure out how to use AI.
And that's such an exciting future as well, where you sort of have this polymath in your pocket that knows all of the world's knowledge, all of your knowledge, all of your company's knowledge, and can help support you in real time. There's been some studies there published recently where they've seen sort of 30-80% productivity gains. What would we do with all of this extra time that we have?
Yeah, so far humanity's not run out of ideas, to generate even more meaningful things for us to do. So I think it's one of the rules I live by. I find really exciting the idea of making humanity more powerful. While it doesn't always work out well, on average, it almost works out well the vast majority of the time. And I think that large language models is making humanity more powerful. And so I use ChatGPT quite frequently myself, and I play with Bard, and I use the Microsoft Bing Edge product. I find that all of these tools make me more productive as a person, and it's so good to see hundreds of millions of people around the world all enjoying these benefits already.
Yeah, I love this early story from Minsky and Engelbart, where they ran into each other, and Minsky was telling Engelbart about all of the stuff he would help computers achieve with AI. And then Engelbart replied, "You're going to do all of this for machines. What are you going to do for humans?" And I feel that we've reached a point now where we're getting radically augmented in our abilities. And this idea of augmented intelligence is really getting applied with ChatGPT more recently. How do you use ChatGPT day to day?
Many diverse specific uses, I think. Sometimes I'll ask a factual question, and then depending on his answer, sometimes fact check it. I use this as thesaurus all the time, as a brainstorming when I'm trying to write something. Pretty diverse use cases, actually. I don't use it that much for debugging my code, but maybe I should. I hear more friends doing that. But it's actually surprisingly diverse use cases. And it's fantastically cheap. So I also use it a lot to test out different business ideas. I tend to use the API calls rather than the web user interface.
Yeah.
But I would be, last weekend I was playing around with it, for many hours over the weekend. And I think I figured out, after hours of playing with it, I think I spent 12 cents. So sometimes it's actually fantastically cheap how I was exploring some ideas, in multiple different application verticals. Yeah. And it's really interesting.
I wonder if you might be one of the best prompt engineers on the planet. It would be fun to have a prompt engineering competition. What makes a good prompt?
Yeah, several weeks ago, my team DeepLearning.ai, working with Isa Fulford at OpenAI, we actually released a free online class on ChatGPT prompt engineering for developers to try to share, with best practices on how to write prompts. One of the things I'm excited about that I think is whose impact is still vastly underestimated is, even though ChatGPT as a web interface, as a consumer product, is widely discussed, ChatGPT, or more broadly, large language models, are incredibly powerful developer tools. And I think the impact in changing how the next generation of machine learning or AI applications will be built, I think that's still vastly underestimated. So that's why our free online course that Deep Learning offered in collaboration with OpenAI hopes to share more best practices with people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But do you think that will be embedded natively into the models instead, that they'll take our prompts and then rewrite those to better prompts? Or do you think there's a role for us to also become better prompt engineers?
Oh, I think there's a huge role for people to play to become better at prompt engineering. Now, I'm not sure that prompt engineering itself will be a major job category. Just like, I don't know, there are many tasks that you have to do. When you train a neural network, you have to tune parameters, but tuning parameters is not a job category. Yeah. But I think that for many machine learning engineers, knowing how to use prompting as a tool will be an important part of their job, and machine learning engineers that can use this tool will be more effective than ones that don't know how to use it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Were you surprised that it ended up being natural language that we instructed these models with?
Yeah, I think I feel like the rapidity with which it took off when ChatGPT was released, I think took me by surprise, and it took a lot of people by surprise. But I think that the academic research leading up to ChatGPT has been going on for a while. So I actually feel like when GPT-3 came out, this was before ChatGPT, my colleagues in NLP and I, we felt, wow, this is exciting. This is a potential game-changing for how to approach machine learning on text data, not on everything, but just on text data. But then it was interesting that it was when OpenAI rolled out this fantastic consumer product, ChatGPT, then I think it caught the popular imagination. But I think a lot of the sparks of that technology being really exciting, learning with very low data, for example, I think that was, very exciting from a research technology perspective.
What would you say has contributed the most to its success?
So it was interesting when the UI of ChatGPT became so easy to use. Then we had, people in all walks of life using it, right? Yeah. And unlike earlier ways of adoption, we see many CEOs themselves using it. So it wasn't the IT person going to the CEO to tell them to check this out. Yeah. It was the CEO checking it out themselves and then telling their IT department, we need to get on this. Yeah. In fact, the Wall Street Journal talks about how Coursera CEO, Jeff Maggioncalda, a fantastic CEO, himself has been playing a lot with ChatGPT to think about how it should affect education. So I think it's exciting that there's so much CEO-driven action. And this is unlike most ways of technological adoption.
Yeah, 100%. And speaking of which, how do you think it will impact education? I was telling you at the beginning how much time I've spent learning from you. Do you think that the medium will change radically? I remember this story from the early days of TV, where we're essentially just shooting radio shows. And I think that's a bit analogous to the early days of MOOCs. We were basically shooting classes. Do you think we'll radically change the development of this content and how it's created? Will you basically just record yourself, synthesize it, feed all your knowledge into a model, and then have an agent teach? Or what do you think will be the instruction model?
I don't know. I think many organizations, Deep Learning AI, Coursera, many organizations are playing around with these ideas right now. There's some that seem to work well, like having a coach so that you can have someone to ask questions, help quiz you, to help you learn along. But then whether this will even more fundamentally change the educational experience, I think the teacher's assistant as well as the personalized student coach, I think those two would be valuable, both to help teachers and to help individual learners. And then beyond that, is there other changes? I think I and many others excited to try to figure that out now.
Fantastic. One thing that I was quite underwhelmed by when starting to get into the neuroscience of how we learn was how little we understand. Have you learned anything from studying it more from a machine learning perspective? You're like, I wonder if this is actually how humans learn as well.
Yeah, I think that I've probably learned more about how humans learn by watching my kids, 2 and 4 years old, than through my work in machine learning. I think, 10, 15 years ago, I was reading a lot of neuroscience papers because I wanted to understand a bit more of how the brain works and translate that to artificial neural networks. But then since then, the whole field of AI has really pivoted away from looking at neuroscience because, as you pointed out, Joe, we have almost no idea how the human brain works. And so trying to take inspiration has been a really tough thing to do. It's been interesting how AI has been driven much more by engineering principles for the last decade than biological inspiration.
But I'm also quite intrigued how well some fairly simple models from neuroscience ended up working, like reinforcement learning and also artificial neural networks. Do you think there are any areas that are underexplored?
So take neural networks. The artificial neural networks we use today, they are unlike anything that the brain does, right? It's a vastly oversimplified model of what the brain is. And I actually suspect, my gut, not proof, but my gut is that there are multiple algorithms that can lead to fantastic levels of intelligence if you feed it the right data. And in fact, human intelligence, our neurons, our brains, took some local optimization path that was driven by evolution, and then we seem to be pretty intelligent. And then today, when I look at the algorithms we use, I feel like there's got to be a better algorithm than deep learning or transformers or whatever. But all of these flavors of algorithms, when we feed it lots of data, some do better than others, but exhibit fascinating levels of intelligence. I think there have to be many, many different algorithms.
Do you think they are better learning algorithms than the ones we have as humans?
Oh, I'd be shocked if there isn't. Given the random local search process of evolution, the human brain, we still have lots of weird things left in our bodies. For example, we still have the remnants of a tail, from when our ancestors had longer tails. Humans have evolved to this, pretty good local optima. I'd be very surprised. I'd be completely shocked if the human learning algorithm were anywhere near the optimal learning algorithm.
And where do you think the cap is? Do you think there's any cap in terms of the models that we use now, or can we just keep training them on larger amounts of data and expect the same correlation when it comes to the intelligence?
So I think that machine intelligence is turning out to be very different than human intelligence. And what we saw in the last decade was, I think the last decade was the decade of large supervised learning models. With large label data sets, we could do fantastic lots of tasks. This decade is turning out to be, to use technical terms, I think it's turning out to be the decade of large pre-trained models. We can take a transformer model, train it on massive amounts of text, and then very quickly, through prompting or fine-tuning, adapt it to new tasks. Or take a vision transformer, train it on massive amounts of images, and then with a little bit of tweaking or prompting or fine-tuning, adapt it to different vision tasks. Now, is this a path to artificial general intelligence? Probably not. I'm pretty sure we still need new algorithmic inventions. But I think that over the last year, we just made 1 year of fantastic, wildly exciting progress, maybe on what will turn out to be a 30 or 50-year journey toward artificial general intelligence.
So you think it's 30, 40 years out?
Maybe 50. I think it's decades out. But it's okay because the machines we have are so fantastically exciting and valuable. It is okay if I could still do some things that a machine can't, because it can do so many things, including things I can't do. That should create a lot of value for everyone.
What would change your time horizon on that?
I think that we still have some fundamental breakthroughs in algorithms to make. For example, actually, Yann LeCun often points out this example. A teenager takes maybe 20 hours, dozens of hours to learn to drive a car. So when will we have an algorithm that can take dozens of hours to learn to drive a car? It turns out that, someone can read a book and then answer lots of questions later, or someone can read a sequence of papers or read a sequence of books and then, write a PhD dissertation thesis after deep knowledge. So how do we get AI to do those things? I hope we'll figure it out. I see no reason why we won't, but I just don't see a clear path to doing all of those things yet.
Yeah, but listening to that and also listening to your conversation with Jan, I take it that you're not scared now. What do you think are the key arguments against the 6-month halt?
So I think that, I think a 6-month, there was the proposal for a 6-month pause in training AI models, large language models more powerful than GPT-4. I thought that's a bad idea for 2 reasons. One is the premise that's dangerous, seems misguided. But then also a 6-month pause is impractical. If you're on a 30 journey, how does a 6-month pause help? And how do you even implement this unless government starts, legislating pauses to technology, which seems very anti-competitive. But then even leaving aside the impracticality of a 6-month pause, I want to get the premise of this idea that AI is an existential risk to humanity or something. So I think there are two things with that argument that I disagree with, I guess. One is sometimes people think, could there be a hard takeoff, right? Is it that today AI doesn't work, but one day, maybe June 15th, this year, it'll suddenly work and it takes over the world in 48 hours of that. Technology doesn't work like that. It just advances slowly. So I hope we'll build AI more intelligent than any person someday. But it's not going to happen overnight, and we'll see it coming for a long time. And then humanity has lots of experience building and then steering organizations more powerful than any single human. So we have corporations and nation states, very powerful entities, and while and for the most part, democracy will kind of manage to steer most corporations and most nation states, not all sadly, but in a pretty positive and constructive way. And so with AI becoming more and more capable, I'm confident we will do that too. And then lastly, if you look at what are the actual existential risks to humanity, I don't know if maybe someday an asteroid will strike the planet, or if climate change causes massive depopulation, so the world starts to fall apart, or the next pandemic, fingers crossed, hopefully not for a long time. I think AI will be a key part of the solution to solving these things. So for humanity to survive and thrive for another 1,000 years, I think the odds of us surviving and thriving are higher with fantastic AI than without AI. So if you want humanity to thrive and survive, I think let's make AI go as fast as possible.
Are there any scenarios that you're more scared about, more near term?
Yes. So I worry about AI fairness, bias. Does AI sometimes contribute to misinformation, polarization of society, concentration of wealth, concentration of power? I think that these are real issues, real risks of AI. And I do think that the AI community is rapidly improving on most of these dimensions. So take large language models, well known for sometimes making stuff up, hallucinating, or sometimes even spewing toxic or highly inappropriate speech. Turns out it's actually getting much safer. It's not perfect, but it's actually much better now than even a couple months ago. So I think AI is making rapid progress on all of these things. But I think fairness, bias, concentration of power, these are real problems. And I think it's unfortunate that excessive hype, about evil sentient AI killer robots, the Terminator scenario, I think that unfortunately distracts us from the real present risk that we should actually be spending time working hard to address.
Of course, but one thing I'm also struck by is that it's not like any of those issues are new. And we've already been dealing with misinformation for a very, very, very long time. But if you were to give some tips for regulators in terms of where they should put their focus, or double down on areas they've already been focusing on, what would those be?
Yeah, I think I have a controversial point of view on this. I feel like a good set of regulations to get started would be to cause more transparency on AI. I do see a risk of, to be candid, European regulators screwing it up. There was draft regulation recently, just draft, thank goodness, with some very problematic things relating to release of open source large language models. But I do think that there's a lot to be said for transparency, because today there are AI systems, that are very black box, or corporations running AI systems are very black box. And without transparency into, did this AI system amplify hate speech or contribute to problematic, even horrible genocidal things? Unless regulators have good visibility into what's actually going on, I think it's impossible to craft thoughtful regulation. So as a first move, I think transparency, hopefully in a way that doesn't stifle innovation, doesn't frankly knock Europe back when other countries are rapidly moving ahead. Not just Europe, but doesn't knock back any region of the world while everyone else trying to advance. I think that would be a very positive step to make sure that regulators then actually understand what's going on to the extent scientifically possible in the corporations and in the businesses using these things. So then after that, it can be a much better position to craft thoughtful regulations.
Yeah, I'm sure you read the leaked memo from Google on open source as well. What role do you think open source will play in this? And is that actually the biggest risk? Because of course we can regulate the companies, but this is going to be much tougher to do with the open source community.
Yeah, it's been interesting. The closed source large language models are ahead of the open source ones, but not by that much, one would argue. And the open source community collectively just has a lot more people working on this. And so the rate of progress is fantastic. And I think that while there are definitely risks to some of these technologies, so far, I think the benefits vastly outweigh the risks. And I'm not at all dismissing the risks. Bias, fairness, AI safety, let's take it seriously. Let's keep working on that.
Yeah.
But I think we have to appreciate the good and the massive value it's creating, even while we take a hard look at the risks and do our best to ameliorate them, and not toss out a really net value generating class of technologies. When Stable Diffusion releases models in this, frankly, somewhat uncontrolled way, saying anyone can run the model, yes, there were problematic use cases, and yes, disparate treatment of different genders, and yes, absolutely, there are bad things. And even as we continue to cast light on and squash the bad things, let's also not lose sight of the fact that when Stable Diffusion released the image generation models in this very open way, it sparked off tremendous creativity. And there are so many applications now possible because they did that.
Yeah, I feel like the open source community is your gang. It's the kids that took your courses, self-taught, and they're now out there dominating. What do you think are the key things we should be learning over the next few years?
I feel like the technology for large language models and image generating, moving into video increasingly, it still feels very early. It still feels very raw. So, when I chat with friends at OpenAI, or when I chat with Harrison, CEO of LangChain, I feel like there are these different things that it's actually very obvious there would be significant improvement in the technology over the next few years. So I think that's exciting. And then even as the technology races ahead, the opportunity to build more and more applications is also insanely exciting. So all that is a massive value creation. And then just one thing I worry about is, job displacement, people left behind. And I think whatever we can do as a society to bring everyone along can only be hopeful. But I'm also nervous about, as you were mentioning, regulators taking unwise actions that actually hinder, large parts of the world rather than lift up their citizens the way that I hope regulators will.
And that's what I find very inspiring as well on the democratization. It took quite a lot of time still to get on with your courses and learning that, but now there's really this democratization where if you understand natural language, you can start interacting with these models. You made a parallel to literacy a while back. Could you elaborate a bit on that parallel?
I see. Yeah, so I think AI coding is the new literacy. Hundreds of years ago, we thought that maybe not everyone needs to be literate. Why do you need to learn to read and write? Just go to the usually holy building and listen to the high priests, the priestesses, and the monks read the holy book to you. Just sit in the audience and listen. Fortunately, we figured out as a society that we're collectively much richer if almost everyone can learn to read and write. And I think today, we're still in that high priest and priestesses era in AI, where most people feel like, I don't need to build AI, we'll just let the high priests and priestesses of the tech world, that is the engineers in the big tech companies, build AI for us. But with the availability of data in today's world, everyone from a corner sole proprietor pizzeria to even a high school student collecting lab biology experiments, everyone has data. And I think if we can democratize not the use of AI, everyone can go and use AI on someone else's website, but we can democratize access to custom AI, custom creation of AI, then everyone can be in a better position to leverage the unique data that they have. And I think that will make society much richer.